The following program contains scenes that some viewers may find disturbing.
In the freezer, there was an enormous amount of blood.
There are 7 dead bodies inside.
Over 20 rounds were fired.
These 7 people did only one thing wrong that day. They went to work.
It was really like a nightmare.
Could this be one person, 2 people, 3 people? At that point, I had no clue.
Ugliest word in this entire case was unsolved.
Palatine, Illinois, a sprawling Chicago suburb just north of the Windy City. Unremarkable in many ways, and yet, past the strip malls and parking lots, a traditional community whose roots run deep.
It was kind of the quintessential suburban town with kids playing football, soccer, and baseball.
It still had a small town feel to it. It was not uncommon for people to leave their doors unlocked.
People care about each other here. Palatine's been the kind of community you'd want to raise a family in.
That's kind of how I think everyone viewed it prior to January 8th, 1993.
It was a Friday. It was our movie night. My brother usually comes home at 10:30, exactly. But that night, he didn't come home.
Jade Solis's big brother Rico is a 17-year-old high school student who works part-time at a local restaurant, Brown's Chicken and Pasta.
Me and my brother really didn't have a lot of friends because we were new here. We immigrated from the Philippines to reunite with my mom and to have a better life.
It's not like Rico to go out after work without calling home.
So by 11 o'clock, we're calling Brown's Chicken. The phone just kept ringing.
I thought they were partying because it was a Friday. I thought he was with Michael Castro.
Michael and Rico, they were good friends, or they were starting to become good friends.
16-year-old Michael Castro works the night shift with Rico.
Mr. Castro contacted the department and said his son hadn't come home.
He met the officers at the scene. They checked some of the doors and told the father that it appears that the business is closed and it looks like they might have gone out.
But Michael's father spots his son's jacket through the window. It's January in Illinois, too cold to go outside without a coat. He begs the officer to check inside.
Officer Conley actually went to the service door on the east side. He actually had to physically pull the door open and it popped open.
The store appeared to be in the final stages of closing. The customer area had all been mopped down. All the trash cans had been emptied.
But still, something's not right. At the back of the restaurant, the police make a disturbing discovery. A blood-soaked mop. What they find next, no one expected.
In the freezer, there was an enormous amount of blood. And then they discovered the bodies.
There were 5 victims. They'd all been shot.
An unbelievable scene, but But it's not the only one.
There were 2 more victims in a large walk-in cooler. It was a very bloody scene.
They had never seen anything like that. This was 7 people killed. What a horrific, brutal crime.
He took one look. The radio call was 7 in the cooler at Brown's. That was the initial defining moment of what would become the most horrible crime in Chicago.
The owners at Brown's Chicken, Richard and Lynn Islandfelt, were the salt of the earth. He used his retirement money into the business, so he was very committed to it.
They literally were putting in 18-hour days almost every day.
Brown's Chicken and Pasta was a part of a chain. Actually, the Palatine franchise was one of the more successful ones. And the Ellenfelds were known for treating their employees like their family.
Yeah, my mom was very active in our lives. We had a brown sack lunch every day with a little note inside and, wishing us good luck on a test or good luck at the soccer game. She was really proud of us, and she was proud to be a mom. I ended up actually making a phone call to the restaurant. And someone did answer, but it was not my mom or dad. It was one of the police officers there. They just had told me that something happened, and I should come over.
As the police units filled the parking lot, rumors of the horrendous crime spread.
And we didn't know exactly what was going on. We just knew that something really bad had happened.
And by the time I got there, the police tape was already up. And I found a police officer, and I went up to him, and I was very upset. And I just said, "Look, that's my mother in there." And he looked at me, and he said, "There's 7 dead bodies inside."
I just want to see my son. And I want to hug him and embrace him. That's what I felt. I just want to hug him and kiss him, but I can't go in there.
Everyone working at the Brown's Chicken that night is dead.
I always felt some sort of responsibility knowing that it was my parents' restaurant. And obviously none of them did anything wrong.
The victims were Richard and Lynn Ihlenfeld. The cook was Tom Menace. Michael Castro and Rico Solis were the young high school kids. Luby Maldonado was another cook. And Marcus Nelson was a manager trainee.
It was really like a nightmare, knowing that I'd never see my son again. I didn't want to believe it.
So that's when we knew kind of our world has changed.
7 murder victims, 7 grieving families. The worst mass murder in Palatine's history launches its biggest homicide investigation. On a freezing January morning in a traumatized Chicago suburb, the police are coming to grips with mass murder. 3 hours after the gruesome discovery at Brown's Chicken and Pasta, more than 20 investigators are on the scene, including lead detectives Sergeant Bill King and Sergeant John Koziol.
The 2 bodies in the cooler, they may have been shot from outside the cooler. They had some plastic strips hanging up, and there was a round through a hole in one of those strips.
Across the kitchen from the cooler is the restaurant's freezer.
The freezer was a small cubicle. You wouldn't think that 5 people could actually even be in there.
They almost had to be standing initially to all fit in there before they were shot.
It appeared that they just fell where they were, and the bodies were intertwined. Also, one of the victims appeared to be chewing fries and was spitting them out as they died. couldn't really test that to say it was, but I just looked like that.
All 7 victims suffered fatal gunshot wounds to the head. Some were shot once, others as many as 6 times. Two were singled out for especially sadistic treatment.
One of the owners, Lynn Eilenfeld, had suffered a knife wound to her neck, and Michael Castro had also suffered a knife wound.
We couldn't imagine that they would have been targeted for any reason. I mean, we were just confused, you know. I mean, one day they're here and then they're not.
Marcus's plans was to be a chef. That's really what he wanted to be. He loved to cook.
My brother Rico wasn't supposed to work that night. There was a basketball game in Palatine. One of the students couldn't make it, so they called my brother to work.
My tears coming out from my eyes is from my heart.
These 7 people did only one thing wrong that day. They went to work. And for that, they lost their lives.
I mean, it really was just a blur, and there was just a lot of tears.
With the investigation barely underway, it's chaos outside. The media is already clamoring for answers.
7 victims, even in the city of Chicago, is a huge story.
This case wasn't just about Palatine. It wasn't just about the Chicago area. This was a crime that reached out and touched people all across the country.
There wasn't much we could tell the media in the beginning. What we had was 7 people murdered in coolers and virtually no witnesses to anything.
Could this be 1 person, 2 people, 3 people? You know, your first thought was it had to be a lot of people. How can they kill 7 people without having help? Was it a robbery? Was it a murder? Was it a domestic that turned into a murder or a robbery? At that point, I had no clue. We wanted to take our time and make sure we did it right. So the first thing we did is we did video and then photos right behind it. And even the outside was videotaped. So the outside of the restaurant all the way around was videotaped, inside was videotaped before we did anything.
Finding evidence isn't going to be easy at a crime scene visited by dozens of people each day.
We were processing walls, doors, anything. So we had hundreds of prints.
Those prints could be from anybody, customers, workers. So we just took any prints we could at the time.
Investigators learned that 21 shots were fired, all from the same gun.
The weapon was a .38.
There were enough shots fired that the gun had to be reloaded at least 3 times, and maybe 4.
That's a tremendous amount of reloading. These poor people, the door closes, maybe they think he's leaving, and then he opens up the door and shoots into the cooler. There's no place for you to go, and then maybe the door closes again and you're just glad you're still alive, and then the door opens again.
Despite all the bullets, investigators can't find a single spent casing.
The fact that there were no shell casings kind of indicates you'd have to be real careful to not miss one. These people were cold and calculating. It's not something you see very often.
In the storeroom, Sergeant Koziol discovers why there is no power to most of the restaurant.
They had shut the lights off using a breaker box in the back. When they did that, though, they shut off the power to the clock, and that clock was stopped at 9:48.
Police discovered that the back door of the restaurant had been jammed shut from the outside. It looks like the Browns' workers were deliberately trapped by their killers. In the cooler, evidence that offers a glimpse into 2 of the victims' last moments.
There's a credit card and a watch that were hidden behind the boxes. And the surmise is Mr. Menes and Richard Ellenfeld were restocking in the cooler. They heard a robbery taking place. And so the first instinct was, let's hide our valuables. And of course, they never got out.
open safe only adds to the mystery.
There was a small amount of cash missing, but there was also cash left behind. Why they didn't take all the money, I can't explain that.
When we went through the register tapes, we located a sale at 9:08. The restaurant closed at 9, but at 9:08, a 4-piece chicken meal was served. And so we surmised that the offenders had come in, ordered a meal, and maybe was staking the restaurant out. When the crime scene techs went through the trash cans,
Trash can liners were all fresh, clean, except for one.
The lone trash can contains a partially eaten meal.
we learned that if they had chicken under the lights at closing time and someone came to the door, they would let them in and serve them that last meal.
If the meal was eaten by the killer, then his leftovers may hold crucial DNA evidence.
DNA could not get anything off those chicken bones in 1993. But they thought that if we save this, maybe someday, we can get something.
We froze it right away.
The receipt for that last meal, along with the stopped clock, give investigators a likely window for the crime.
That's 40 minutes from pillar to post.
It looked like they had spent a lot of time focused on forensics and protecting themselves from being caught. But there was a coupon that had fallen off one of the counters. Now it's all pristine in there except for this coupon laying on the floor. And there was a Nike footprint on that coupon. It matched none of the victims.
The murder weapon is nowhere to be found. The building has no video surveillance. With only a shoe print to go on, catching the monster who did this won't be easy.
Standing in that restaurant, we all knew what we were up against.
You always hope that it's going to solve tomorrow, but we were prepared, whatever, however long it takes, that's how long it's going to be on it.
Back at the police station, the phones are ringing off the hook.
Okay, please.
Well, almost immediately, tips started coming in. And one came in about a man named Martin Blake.
23-year-old Martin Blake, a former cook at Brown's, had been fired just a week earlier.
You always have to look at ex-employees in these cases, particularly ones that have been fired and have a grudge.
I was familiar with him from the store. And there were some rumors flying around that my dad had had some argument in the back of the restaurant with him.
We received a couple of calls from friends of his saying that he was angry with the owners for being fired. One of the other things that was of interest was Mark had dated Michael Castro's sister, who had recently broken off with Martin, and Michael Castro had received more gunshot wounds than any other victim, quite a bit more. Other friends said when they were talking to him on the phone, he was shooting a handgun inside his residence. That's an unusual activity.
What's more, an eyewitness reports being turned away from the restaurant the night of the massacre by a suspicious-looking man.
We had a woman who came up to buy chicken that night after the restaurant had closed, and she told us there was someone inside with dark shoulder-length hair who said, "We're closed."
She had said in her statement to the police, and I think I could identify that person, they did a photo array. They put Martin Blake's photograph into the photo array. It said, you know, "Do you recognize anyone?" And she said, "This guy looks like him." So they had a good lead.
Right away, officers chase down Blake and surprise him at his home.
I guess you don't really know what a murderer is supposed to look like, but he didn't look like what you would expect a murderer to look like.
Since the shocking mass murder at this family-run chicken franchise near Chicago, police have taken a recently fired employee into custody.
When I found out that they've caught someone, I cried. It was tears of joy.
Less than 24 hours after the carnage, Palatine police think they've found their killer. But have they? Chicago is no stranger to violent crime. But the savage killing of 7 workers in a suburban fast food restaurant is big news.
With townspeople still in shock, police keep gathering evidence and refusing comment on a motive and won't say if charges are pending against the suspect now in custody.
24 hours after the massacre, homicide detectives get a search warrant for the home of prime suspect Martin Blake.
They went into Martin Blake's house, they tore out the walls.
We located the gun inside his residence.
Detectives grill Blake about where he was the night before.
Didn't initially give us his alibi. We found that highly unusual. He would say things like, I don't want to get my friends involved.
Then Blake changes his tune. He claims he was home, drinking with friends. He left once to get beer. After 24 hours of interrogation, Blake clams up. Pressure to build a case against him mounts. And that's when the detectives are thrown an unexpected curve.
The woman who had picked him out of a photo array had picked up the local newspaper and saw pictures of the 7 victims. She called the task force in a panic and said, I've misidentified that man. The person I saw was Rico Solis inside that restaurant.
If she's right, her casual encounter with the young Rico Solis came moments before he was gunned down. At a police lineup, the witness can't ID Blake as the man she saw in the restaurant. A central pillar in the case is gone. Investigators have no choice but to let him go.
Police yesterday released their only suspect after 48 hours of questioning. At the first in a series of funerals today, friends consoled the family of Dick and Lynn Ehlenfeld, the restaurant's owners.
To have 18 and 20, 23-year-old girls trying to figure out what to do with their parents, everything, their life, essentially, is very overwhelming, and you don't know where to begin.
Every night when I'd go to bed, I'd lay awake most of the night thinking, why did this happen?
The funeral, I remember walking in there, and I just started crying.
Day 5 of the investigation. A multi-agency task force sets up shop in a vacant school building in Palatine. Chicago Police, the Cook County Sheriff's Office, the FBI, and the Illinois State Police are now all working the case.
Just the victimology alone, which is where you go into the victims' lives to find out if they were maybe targeted. When you have 7 victims, all these things multiply, so it is the kind of case you need help on.
The amount of officers that were working the case was over 100. There was right away the neighborhood canvas. There was plenty of stores, plenty of shops.
So you stopped cars and interviewed people. I'm asking them if they saw anything.
Dozens of former Browns employees are also interviewed. Since the killer seemed familiar with the restaurant, it's a crucial part of the investigation.
Killing 7 people with one gun, where you have to reload and reload, that takes a level of distance and coldness that is almost impossible to comprehend.
Fear hangs like a dark cloud over the Chicago suburb. The police are under the gun.
They were certainly working around the clock on this, but there wasn't anything breakthrough that was coming.
Then, a week into the investigation, a promising lead from a prison informant.
It involved an inmate named Ronaldo Aviles. He'd been arrested for an armed robbery in the city of Chicago, And he called the task force and said that he'd had a phone call with an individual named Jose Cruz, a gang member in the city, and Cruz had told him that he'd done the Browns murders.
The two men belonged to one of Chicago's most notorious gangs, the Puerto Rican Stones.
There had been a Hispanic gang doing armed robberies of restaurants, so the detectives ran with that lead.
If the Browns Chicken Massacre was a gangland robbery gone bad, is Jose Cruz the man who pulled the trigger?
He was considered a strong suspect. Someone said that they had seen him in a bar the night before the Browns massacre.
Under questioning, Aviles reveals an incriminating detail about Jose Cruz. His favorite gun is a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson.
It fit the characteristics of our murder weapon.
I didn't want to become very excited, but I knew that maybe there was something to this.
The case against Cruz looks good, until the police discover a fatal flaw in Ronaldo Aviles' story.
And he claimed he had contacted Jose Cruz at this phone booth. This is long before the age of a lot of cell phones. Well, that phone booth didn't take incoming calls.
The crucial phone conversation never happened. The prison snitch is lying.
Jose Cruz was brought in and interviewed at length, and he knew nothing about our crime.
To make matters worse, the case against their only other suspect has also fallen apart. The police find no hard evidence pointing to Martin Blake.
The gun, it was a .22 caliber, so that gun was not involved in our crime.
If you find the right guys, it'll be like a puzzle. Pieces will fit. You don't have to force one in. And in the Martin Blake case, would have been forcing the whole thing in. You would have to break all the puzzle pieces to get it together.
I felt sorry for him because, you know, it wasn't him.
There were people that were coming out of that task force office and saying, I think we've got our man, that sort of thing. And ultimately it would turn out not to be.
There are many times where you think, oh, we're getting close, and you're at the top, and then all of a sudden you realize it's going down.
Investigators are back to square one. Pressure to solve one of the nation's most notorious murders is unrelenting. The reward offered for information leading to a conviction is a jaw-dropping $100,000.
But what we really needed is the right tip.
Every lead we looked at as closely as we could, and I worked as hard as I could. And when the lead didn't pan out, you went to the next one.
We weren't losing hope, but it was getting there.
Unless Sergeant Koziel and his team can find the missing pieces of the puzzle, the victims' families will have no closure, and a stone-cold killer will remain free.
The ugliest word in this entire case was unsolved.
Three months have passed since a massacre at a fast food restaurant rocked the Chicago suburb of Palatine. With no new suspects, investigators look into other recent unsolved crimes in the area.
A neighboring town of ours, around the time of our murder, discovered a torso of a victim along some railroad tracks. His head and hands had been cut off.
The dead man was a 22-year-old petty criminal named Dean Fawcett, shot and then dismembered.
And they developed some suspects in that case who were friends of his.
Paul Madrowski and Robert Faraci were doing a check cashing scheme, and they were using Dean Fawcett's checks, and word was that Dean was going to tell on them.
We received information from one of those suspects' wives claiming that her husband, Bobby Faraci, and his friend Paul Madrowski had not only killed this Dean Fawcett, those two had also been involved in our crime.
The police haul both suspects in for questioning. 18-year-old Paul Madrowski is a loner from nearby McKenna. Rumored to be a white supremacist, he's exactly the kind of person who would have hated the multicultural staff at Brown's. Robert Faraci, 27, is a friend who's been helping Modrowski pass forged checks.
We thought these people had been involved in our crime.
Now we had two men whose faces we could put to this crime. We could focus the anger.
But Palatine police still need physical evidence. They scour the site where the torso was dumped for anything that might link the two men to the Browns massacre. But nothing. Detective Koziol presses Faraci's wife, Rose, the source of the lead, for more information.
But the wife, while alleging she'd been told by her husband they had done our murders, she was actually alibying them for the night of the crime. They'd had a party at their house. They had all these witnesses that put her husband and Modrowski at this party.
So that was another, false lead.
Both men have cast iron alibis for the night of the Brown's Chicken massacre. Modrowski and Faraci still face murder charges, but only for the killing of Dean Fawcett.
While that case cleared and it was good for that community to solve that crime, we were still back at square one.
That was when newspapers were starting to write editorials about the Keystone Cops' nature of this investigation.
For many weeks and even months, oftentimes it was still, front page news.
To be honest, they mishandled the case in the beginning. All the families are curious, what's happening?
We didn't really have any more information at that point than we did the night of the murders.
Thousands of leads and 4 publicly named suspects later, investigators are no closer to cracking the case. And as the months turn into years, evidence fades.
Footprints become worthless after a period of time because the shoes get worn out, the shoes get thrown away. That becomes almost valueless.
It is very difficult over time to not become cynical. It's beyond depressing.
At the same time, forensic science progresses. 5 years after the killings, a breakthrough in DNA analysis offers renewed hope.
In 1998, we learned that the Illinois State Police was one of the leaders in our country at amplified DNA processing.
The new technology started looking at very tiny pieces of DNA, and they're so tiny that they don't degrade, and you don't need a lot of DNA in order to get a profile.
As well, DNA profiles can now be drawn from saliva, not just blood. Detective Koziol turns to the one piece of evidence that's been frozen for years: the last meal rung up on the register.
The chicken dinner that was found in the trash can, we saved that.
The chicken became a very important piece of evidence.
They then brought it to the Illinois State Police Crime Laboratory, and their assignment was to determine whether there was any saliva on any of the bones.
After 5 years, the chance of finding a trace of saliva seems remote.
We knew it was going to be a long shot.
But the long shot pays off.
They were able to get the DNA off the chicken and then process it and get a profile.
It was a male profile, and it was an exceedingly rare profile.
Investigator King called me and says, "We've finally got a piece of evidence in this case we can rely on."
As valuable as it is, a DNA profile alone doesn't solve the case.
Only as good as what you can find a match against it. By itself, it's just like a fingerprint. It's just there.
So we went and used that DNA and checked all the old suspects, and none of them matched.
They run the DNA profile through the police databases nationwide. Still no match. The investigation is back in limbo, and it stays that way until March 2002, a full 9 years after the massacre.
A female had called the station and wanted to speak with someone regarding the Browns.
The woman, Ann Lockett, is a former Palatine resident.
Ann told Sergeant King that she knew who had killed the people at the Brown's Chicken. She said her boyfriend at the time, back in 1993, and a friend of his committed the murders.
Detectives are wary.
You want to know who did it?
Now, you have to keep in mind, we had many former girlfriends claiming former boyfriends had done these murders.
I had heard this story before, so I told her that, I would look into it.
Is this another dead end? Or the tip that will help Palatine police finally break their most notorious cold case?
I could understand why he was a bit skeptical. There were almost 5,000 leads before me. So why would he believe me?
Almost a decade after mass murder in suburban Chicago shocked the nation, the Palatine cops have a new lead. An informant claims two young men, Juan Luna and Jim Degorski, committed the grisly crime.
Ann Lockett was a girlfriend of Jim Degorski through high school. And she broke up with him, though, after high school.
He was in the behavior disorder classes. He was tough, did a lot of drugs. He and his friend Juan had tortured some animals in their garage.
In January 1993, Juan Luna was just 18 years old. His buddy Jim Degorski was 20. Ann says a phone call from her then-boyfriend the day after the massacre is etched in her memory.
He said that he had done something big and I needed to watch the news.
Weekend murders in a fast food restaurant have spread fear among residents in Palatine, Illinois.
And the lead story on the news was the Brown's Chicken Massacre.
She claims that a few days later, she talked with both men at Degorski's apartment.
They wanted to tell me about the murders. They asked me, do you want to know what happened?
What they told her was that Juan Luna wanted to ice someone, and Degorski said that he would help.
He wanted to see what it would feel like. I couldn't believe it in the beginning.
Lockett's story intrigues investigators. One detail in particular grabs their attention.
Juan and Jim told me that one of the younger males, he vomited, and I almost didn't say that because it was pretty inconsequential.
That was a detail that had never, ever been released by the police. And for her to know that meant that she had to have had a conversation with someone who was there.
According to Lockett, Luna and Degorski thought Brown's Chicken would be an easy target.
Juan Luna worked there in June of '92, which is 8 months before the murder.
So he was familiar with the layout. He was familiar that there was no security there. He was familiar with the closing procedures.
As a former employee, Juan Luna was one of dozens of people interviewed by the police in the days after the massacre.
He had left the restaurant, but when we investigated why he had left for a better job. That all checked out. He had no animosity towards the owners or anything that we were aware of.
The one's very charismatic, very likable, so you wouldn't guess.
But why, if her story is true, does Lockett wait 9 years to tell it?
Ann Lockett advised that she was scared for her life.
You're not going to tell anyone. Say yes.
And I remember Jim saying, if I ever tell anybody, he's going to kill me.
You're going to end up exactly like those people. I swear to God, I'll kill you myself. You got it?
And in my mind, okay, well, you've killed 7. What's 8?
That's a threat you have to take seriously. If you believe that these men just killed 7 people.
The police dig up information on the 2 men. Luna still lives in the Chicago area, working as an appliance installer, supporting a wife and a young son. Degorski has moved to Indiana, where he holds down a job at an auto detailing shop.
There was nothing that would suggest, oh yeah, those 2 guys are mass murderers, just waiting for the opportunity.
These 2 remained friends, even though Degorski moved to Indianapolis.
I called them up and said I would like to get your DNA. And oddly enough, and very simply, they both gave up their DNA, and I sent it to the lab.
The two new suspects, it seems, have nothing to hide. But what will the DNA analysis reveal?
Sergeant King walked into my office one day, a few weeks later, and says, "We've got a match on the chicken to Juan Luna." And it's one of the happiest days of our life.
And once the hit was made to Luna, they were put under 24-hour watch.
The next day, the police make their move, arresting Juan Luna at a Chicago gas station.
You know, nobody's going down like you see in the movies where they're going to shoot it out and go out in a blaze of glory. He went along very meekly, and same with Degorski.
Both suspects were taken into custody almost simultaneously. Neither was able to tip each other off.
Today, the Palatine Police Department and the Illinois State Crime Lab announced the arrest of James Eric Degorski and Juan A. Luna for the murder of 7 workers at the Brown's Chicken and Pasta restaurant on January 8th, 1993.
It was a moment where people in Palatine and around Chicago had to deal with this wasn't some drifter who went through there. This was 2 of their own.
In custody, it doesn't take long before Luna and Degorski confess to the murders.
So we not only had the DNA, we now had the confessions, so we knew that we had our 2 offenders.
How could anyone kill these people for doing nothing besides running a business and working in a business?
Almost 10 years after one of the most brutal crimes in Chicago history, the chilling details of the Brown's Chicken Massacre are finally revealed.
Luna and Degorski drove to a parking lot some distance away.
They went over there with pockets full of bullets.
They put a wedge on the outside of the back entrance to the restaurant. So when someone tried to run out, they could not.
They came in. It was right about closing time, about 9 o'clock.
Ordered the meal, and they sat down.
So these people were being nice, letting them in to eat. Little did they know.
They threw the chicken into the garbage. They then put on their gloves.
Gun comes out. Michael Castro tried to come from behind the counter and was shot.
And then they put everybody into the freezer. One of the employees actually tried to run out the back door and got stopped because the wedge was in the door on the outside and he couldn't open it.
Juan Luna orders Lynn Ellenfeld to open the safe. He has a knife and he slashes her throat.
With the rest of their victims cornered and helpless, Luna and Degorski showed no mercy.
They both took turns shooting the gun.
And they were just shot as they cowered.
After mopping the floor and shutting off the lights, Luna and Degorski quietly walk out of the restaurant. Luna and Degorski, 2 days later, are found dead. Their bodies are found in the back of the restaurant. The killers left, carrying bags of garbage.
Somebody sees him walking out of there, he can be walking up to the dumpster and throwing them in there like an employee throwing away trash.
The cash pocketed from the horrendous crime totaled less than $2,000.
They went there to kill. It was not to rob. It was to kill.
The question everyone always asks is motive. Why did you do this? And it's always been frustrating to us and to the families, and they just did it to do something big. James Degorski took Juan's car to a self-serve car wash. He opened up both doors of the car and sprayed out the interior of the car with a high-pressure washer. Make sure he got rid of all trace evidence in the car.
Jim Degorski told us that he took the gun to the Carpentersville Dam and threw it in the Fox River. Even though we didn't physically find it, we were able to determine where he got it.
James Degorski gave us information on who had sold him the handgun. We went and found that individual. I remember when he opened the door to his home, his eyes welled up, and he said, "I saw the press conference. I knew you were coming."
Incredibly, the two young men committed mass murder mainly for kicks. Then, for the next 9 years, these natural-born killers lived quiet, respectable lives with not so much as a brush with the law.
That's one of the mysteries of this, is how these two men could commit something so cold and so horrible, and then, as if they walked through the looking glass, turned into sort of normal people. Because anybody who kills 7 people like that cannot be normal.
At the trial, Juan Luna and James Degorski are found guilty on all 7 counts of murder. They are sentenced to life in prison.
I know we got the right guys. I'm satisfied. And life in prison is not as good as death, but that'll do.
We got the case cleared, and we're moving on, but even when they know all that, their loved ones are still gone.
In our heart, we're still hurting.
It definitely brought up a lot of just anger and hatred and revenge, kind of core human emotions.
I felt like in my heart that they should have got the death penalty, but I know one day they will pay because they will answer to a higher judge.